Nobody on Horizon Ring ever paid attention to the human girl who sorted cargo labels in Bay 14. She was small by galactic standards. 5 feet 6 inches of soft brown skin, dark hair pulled into a messy knot, and hands that were always busy scanning crates or tapping inventory codes in her datapad. Her name was Rita Halsey. She was 24 years old, and she had been living on the station for 11 months without making a single enemy or a single friend. That second part changed because of a flower. Rita had been walking through the botanical archive on her lunch break when she noticed a small alien struggling to lift a specimen tray onto a high shelf. The alien was a Mirati, barely 4 feet tall, with translucent lavender skin that glowed faintly in low light, and 4 thin arms that looked like they might snap under the weight of a heavy thought. Her name was Solhai, and she had been trying to reach that shelf for 15 minutes. Rita walked over, took the tray, and placed it on the shelf without a word. Solhai had stared at her with wide silver eyes and said thank you in a voice so quiet it barely existed. Rita had nodded and walked away. The next day, she found a small purple flower on her workstation in Bay 14. No note, no explanation, just a flower that smelled like rain on warm stone. That was 5 months ago. Now, they ate lunch together every day. It was a strange friendship by any measure. Rita was quiet because she had learned that being loud on a station full of aliens who thought humans were primitive was a waste of energy. Solhai was quiet because she had been born that way. The Mirati were a gentle species, evolved on a low-gravity moon where the loudest sound was wind moving through crystal forests. They had no natural weapons, no claws, no venom, no armor. The galaxy considered them decorative at best and pathetic at worst. Rita did not consider Solhai pathetic. She considered Solhai the kindest person she had ever met on any world in any species. Solhai remembered the names of every plant in the archive. She remembered Rita's birthday. She remembered that Rita liked the color blue and once spent an entire afternoon finding a blue leaf specimen from a distant system just to put on Rita's desk. Nobody had ever done anything like that for Rita before. Horizon Ring was not a kind place. It was a trade station on the outer edge of council space, and it operated on a simple principle. Money moved, and whoever controlled the money controlled the station. On paper, a security council managed law and order. In reality, the Dravine Syndicate ran everything that mattered. The syndicate was led by a commander named Gulsher. He was a Dravine, a reptilian species that stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in natural bone-like plating that could stop a blade. Gulsher had arrived on Horizon Ring 2 years ago with a crew of enforcers and had quietly taken control of the lower decks, the merchant corridors, and the docking bays. He collected protection fees. He settled disputes with violence. He answered to nobody. Most species on the station accepted this the way they accepted artificial gravity. It was simply part of the environment. You paid your fee. You kept your head down. You survived. The Security Council looked the other way because Gulsher kept the worst criminal elements off the station, and that was good enough for them. Rita knew about the syndicate. Everyone did. She paid her fee every cycle without complaint. She had no interest in trouble. She had her work, she had her small quarters on Deck 9, and she had Solhai. That was enough. The only thing Rita did that anyone noticed was walk Solhai home after every shift. IT had started after Solhai mentioned that a group of Bravari dock workers had blocked her path one evening and made fun of her size. They had not touched her, but Solhai had been shaking when she told the story. Rita had listened, nodded once, and the next evening she was waiting outside the botanical archive when Solhai's shift ended. She had been waiting there every evening since. The Bravari never bothered Solhai again. Not because Rita threatened them. She never said a word to them. She simply walked beside Solhai through the corridor, and something about the way the human moved, steady, balanced, eyes forward, shoulders loose, made the dock workers decide that there were easier targets available. This was the life Rita had built. Small, quiet, safe. IT ended on a Tuesday. Rita finished her shift in Bay 14 at the usual time. She walked to the botanical archive at the usual pace. She turned the corner into the main greenhouse room, expecting to see Solhai watering her specimens the way she always did, humming a Mirity lullaby under her breath. Instead, she found an empty workstation, tools scattered across the floor, a specimen tray shattered against the base of a shelf, soil everywhere, and on the wall beside the door, a thin streak of pale violet. Rita stood very still. She knew what Mirity blood looked like. She had looked it up months ago, back when she first started walking Solhai home, because she wanted to know what to watch for if her friend ever got hurt. Mirity bled violet. Their blood oxidized quickly in standard atmosphere and turned dark purple within minutes. This streak was still bright. Rita touched the wall with 2 fingers. The blood was wet and warm. Whatever had happened here had happened recently. Very recently. She pulled her hand back and looked at the violet on her fingertips. She did not wipe it off. She closed her fingers slowly into a fist and held it at her side. Then she started walking. The lower decks of Horizon Ring smelled like engine coolant and old metal. Most station residents avoided them after dark. The lighting was bad, the ventilation was worse, and the maintenance corridors down there twisted and branched like the roots of a dying tree. Rita moved through them without hesitation. She had memorized the layout of the lower decks during her first month on the station. It was something humans did without thinking, mapping escape routes, noting exits, measuring distances. On Earth, this instinct kept ancestors alive when predators appeared. On Horizon Ring, it meant Rita could navigate in near darkness while most aliens needed guidance lights just to find a bathroom. She found Solhai in Corridor D17, tucked behind a broken ventilation unit. The Mirity was curled into a tight ball on the cold floor. 2 of her 4 arms hung at wrong angles, clearly broken. Her translucent skin, normally a soft lavender, was mottled with dark purple bruises that spread across her torso and face like ink stains. One of her silver eyes was swollen shut. She was shaking so badly that her remaining good arms could not hold herself steady. Rita knelt beside her. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She placed one hand gently on Solhai's shoulder and said her name once, quietly. Solhai opened her one good eye. When she recognized Rita, she made a sound, a thin, broken whimper that was the Mirity equivalent of sobbing. She tried to reach for Rita with her unbroken arms, and the movement made her cry out in pain. Rita said, "It is okay." She said, "I am here." She said, "I'm going to pick you up now, and it is going to hurt, and I am sorry." Then she lifted Solhai off the floor as carefully as a person holding something made of glass, and she carried her through the corridors toward the medical bay. Solhai weighed almost nothing. Mirity bones were hollow, like a bird's. That was why they broke so easily. Whoever had done this had not needed to hit hard. They had just needed a hit that on the way to the medical bay, Solhai whispered what happened. Her voice kept breaking, and Rita had to lean close to hear. Gulcher's enforcers had come to the botanical archive. 2 of them, big Dravine males with scarred plating and heavy hands. They told Solhai there was a new tax, an additional fee for operating in a premium section of the station. Solhai told them she had already paid her protection fee for this cycle. She showed them the receipt on her datapad. They took the datapad and crushed it. Then they told her the new tax was not optional. When Solhai said she did not have the credits, one of them grabbed her by 2 of her arms and lifted her off the ground. The other one hit her across the face. They told her she had 3 days to find the money, or they would come back and break what was left. Then they dropped her and walked away. Solhai had crawled in the maintenance corridor because she was afraid they would come back. Rita listened to every word without interrupting. Her face did not change expression. Her breathing did not quicken. She carried Solhai into the medical bay and laid her gently on a treatment bed and told the station medic, a Faluri named Dawson, what had happened. Dawson was a decent doctor. He set Solhai's broken arms, applied regenerative patches to her bruises, and gave her a mild sedative for the pain. While he worked, he spoke to Rita in the careful tone of someone delivering a truth that nobody wanted to hear. There was nothing to be done about the syndicate, he said. Gulcher's people did this to someone every few weeks. It was how they maintained control. Filing complaints was useless. The Security Council would not act. The best thing Solhai could do was pay the new tax and move on. Rita thanked him for his help. Then she went to the Security Council office on Deck 3 and filed a formal complaint. She listed the names of the enforcers based on Solhi's description. She included the location, the time, and the nature of the injuries. She submitted the complaint through proper channels and received a confirmation number. The complaint was dismissed within an hour. Insufficient evidence, the notification said. Rita read the notification on her datapad, standing alone in the corridor outside the security office. She read it twice. Then she put the datapad away and walked back to the medical bay. She sat beside Solhi's bed. The sedative had taken effect, and Solhi was sleeping, or something close to sleeping. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Every few seconds, one of her broken arms would twitch, and she would whimper softly without waking. Rita watched her friend breathe. A Faluri nurse came by to check Solhi's vitals. She glanced at Rita and then glanced again, and something about what she saw made her take a half step backward. She finished her checks quickly and left. Later, in the staff break room, the nurse told a colleague about the human sitting beside the Marati's bed. She said the human was not crying. She was not angry. She was not doing anything at all. She was just sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes open and her face completely empty. The colleague asked what was frightening about that. The nurse thought for a moment and said she had once seen a documentary about Earth predators. There was a species called a wolf that would sit perfectly still at the edge of a tree line, watching a herd of animals, sometimes for hours before it moved. The human, she said, looked exactly like that. Not angry. Not sad. Not anything she had a word for, just watching. And waiting. And deciding. 3 days was a generous amount of time when you knew how to use it. Rita spent the first 6 hours after leaving the medical bay in her quarters on Deck 9, sitting cross-legged on her bunk with her datapad open in front of her. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She accessed every station schematic available through her logistics clearance, deck layouts, ventilation maps, power grid routing, gravity, plating configurations, emergency lighting circuits. She had legitimate access to all of it. Her job required her to know where cargo moved, which meant she needed to know how the station was built. Nobody had ever considered this a security risk. Logistics handlers were supposed to be boring .by morning. Rita had a complete mental map of the Syndicate's territory on the lower decks. She knew which corridors Gulcher's enforcers patrolled, what times they changed shifts, where their blind spots were, and which doors could be locked remotely using maintenance override codes. She went to work in Bay 14 at her normal time. She sorted cargo labels. She scanned crates. She ate lunch alone because Solhi was still in the medical bay. At the end of her shift, she visited Solhi, sat with her for an hour, and told her about a blue flower she had seen in a cargo manifest from the Ravani system. Solhi smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. Rita squeezed her good hand gently and left. Then she went to the cargo bay and began collecting tools. She did not take weapons. Horizon Ring had weapon scanners at every major corridor junction, and carrying a firearm or energy blade would trigger an immediate security response. Instead, she took things that belonged in a cargo bay. A heavy industrial wrench, a spool of magnetic cutting wire used for opening sealed freight containers, 2 magnetic clamps designed to secure heavy crates during transport, a pair of insulated work gloves rated for handling superheated materials. None of these items would trigger a scanner. None of them were classified as weapons under station regulations. All of them could break bones. In her quarters that night, Rita modified her standard-issue work boots. She removed the smooth soles and replaced them with grip pads salvaged from a cargo loader. The new soles would give her traction on metal flooring, even wet metal, even if the gravity plating fluctuated. She tested them by running sprints through the empty cargo tunnels on Deck 12 at 2 in the morning when the corridors were deserted. She was fast. Not as fast as a Bravari, who had 4 legs, or a Dravine, whose powerful tails gave them explosive forward momentum. But she was fast enough, and more importantly, she could change direction without slowing down. Human ankles and knees were built for lateral movement. Most galactic species moved in straight lines. The next day, she did pull-ups on the pipe conduits in her quarters until her shoulders burned. She practiced moving through tight spaces, under bunks between wall panels, through maintenance hatches that most species could not fit through. She shadowboxed in the dark with her eyes closed, working from memory alone, training her body to fight in zero visibility. She was not a soldier. She had never been in the military. She had never even been in a real fight. But she was a human, and humans carried 2 million years of predatory evolution in their muscles and reflexes whether they used it or not. The instinct was always there, sleeping under the surface like coals under ash. All it needed was a reason to wake up. Solhai was that reason. On the second day, the other two humans on the station noticed something was wrong. Harlan and Bree were a married couple in their 40s who ran a small repair shop on Deck 6. They had been on Horizon Ring for 3 years, and they knew how the station worked. Harlan found Rita in the cargo bay and asked her if she was okay. Rita thanked him and said she was fine. Harlan looked at the wrench in her hand and the cutting wire coiled on her belt and the new saws on her boots, and he knew she was not fine. He told her that going after the syndicate was suicide. He told her that one human against a dozen armed Dravine enforcers was not a fight. It was a death sentence. Rita listened politely and said she appreciated his concern. Harlan left feeling sick to his stomach. He told Bree what he had seen, and Bree closed the repair shop early. Word had already spread that the human had filed a complaint against the syndicate. In the merchant corridors, aliens laughed about it. A human challenging Gulsher. It was like a ground beetle challenging a warship. Amusing. Sad, maybe, but not serious. Not everyone laughed. An elderly Pylock merchant named Finn, who had traded across the galaxy for 60 years and had seen more species rise and fall than most people could name, heard the story and immediately locked his shop. He told his young assistant to avoid the lower decks until further notice. The assistant asked why. Finn sat down behind his counter and rubbed his eyes with his lower hands. He said he had visited Earth once, decades ago. A research trip. He had watched a documentary in a human museum about a creature called a honey badger. Small animal. Not particularly strong, not particularly fast. But when threatened, it would attack animals 50 times its size and simply refuse to stop until one of them was dead. The assistant asked what that had to do with anything. Finn looked at him with tired eyes and said that humans were the only species in the known galaxy that kept honey badgers as pets, and there was probably a reason for that. Then he turned off his shop lights and went upstairs. At exactly midnight on the third day, every light in the syndicate's lower deck territory went dark. It happened without warning. One moment, the corridors of decks 15 through 18 were lit in the standard cold white glow of station lighting. The next moment, nothing. Pure, absolute blackness. The kind of dark that pressed against your eyes and made you feel like the walls had disappeared. The first enforcer to react was a Dravine named GOL. He was stationed at the junction of corridors C9 and C12, and when the lights died, he immediately reached for his helmet lamp. Dravine eyes were designed for bright, sun-drenched environments. In total darkness, they were nearly blind. Every enforcer on the lower decks carried a helmet lamp for exactly this kind of situation. That GOL's lamp did not turn on. He tapped it. He smacked it. He pulled it off and shook it. Nothing. The magnetic field that powered the small lamp had been drained. He did not know how. He did not know that someone with logistics clearance had spent the previous night accessing the lower deck power grid and systematically routing electromagnetic pulses through the lighting and small device circuits in a precise sequence that would kill everything below deck 14 exactly when she wanted it dead. GOL reached for his communicator instead. Also dead, in the darkness, something moved. It was not loud. It was not fast. It was just a shift in the air, a change in pressure that GOL felt against his scales before he heard anything. He turned toward it and opened his mouth to shout a warning. Something hard and heavy hit him across the jaw. His head snapped sideways, and his body followed, crashing into the corridor wall. Before he could recover, something wrapped around his wrist, tight, thin, impossibly strong, and yanked his arm behind his back at an angle that Dravine joints were not designed to bend. He heard the crack before he felt the pain. Then the pain arrived, and he screamed. The scream echoed through the dark corridors, and every enforcer on the lower decks heard it. They did not hear what came after, because what came after was silence. Rida moved through the Syndicate's territory like water, through a pipe system. She knew every turn, every hatch, every dead end. She had walked these corridors dozens of times during her lunch breaks over the past 2 days, memorizing them with the quiet precision of someone who understood that preparation was the difference between survival and death. Humans were not the best predators in the galaxy. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most naturally armed. But they had something that no other species in the known galaxy possessed in the same combination: endurance, adaptability, and spatial memory that operated independent of light. A human who had studied a space could navigate it blind. A human who had planned an attack could execute it in total silence. A human who had decided to fight could keep fighting long after species twice their size had collapsed from exhaustion. Rida had decided to fight. The second enforcer went down in corridor D4. She caught him from behind, used a magnetic clamp to pin his weapon arm to a wall support beam, and struck him 3 times with a wrench. Once in the knee, once in the ribs, once across the back of his neck. He dropped and did not get up. The third and fourth enforcers were together in the main supply room. They had managed to find a chemical glow stick and were holding it between them, the faint green light making their scaled faces look like something from a nightmare. Rida came through the ceiling hatch above them. She dropped onto the larger one's shoulders, wrapped the cutting wire around his weapon arm, and pulled until he released his plasma blade. The smaller one lunged at her, and she sidestepped him so cleanly that he crashed into his partner. She put them both down with a wrench before either could stand. The fifth enforcer ran. He made it 30 meters down corridor E7 before Rida caught him. Humans could not outrun a Dravine in a straight line, but the corridor was not straight. It curved, and Rida cut the angle by going through a maintenance hatch. She was waiting for him when he came around the bend. The sixth enforcer tried to fight. He was big, nearly Gulcher's size, and he swung at Rida with enough force to crack a bulkhead. She ducked under his arm, grabbed the magnetic clamp, and slapped it against his chest plate. Then she activated the clamp's full magnetic charge. The enforcer was yanked backward and pinned against the metal wall like an insect on a board. He struggled and roared, but the clamp held. Rida left him there. The seventh enforcer had barricaded himself in a storage room. Rida did not bother breaking down the door. She accessed the room's gravity plating through a wall panel and increased it to 3 times standard. Inside the room, the enforcer was pressed flat against the floor under his own weight. Unable to move, unable to breathe deeply, unable to do anything except lie there and wonder what kind of creature was doing this. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, dim red backup lighting that turned the corridors into something out of a fever dream, 7 Dravine enforcers were scattered across the lower decks. All alive, all conscious, all injured badly enough that none of them would be walking anywhere for a long time. Rida stood in the central corridor of Deck 16. There was blood on her wrench. There was blood on her hands. Some of it was violet, from where Soul High's dried blood still stained her knuckles. Most of it was not. She wiped her face with the back of her glove and kept walking. She was not done yet. The commander was still upstairs. Gulcher's command office sat at the top of Deck 13, behind a reinforced door that required a biometric scan to open. It was the most secure room in the Syndicate's territory. Armored walls, soundproofed, a private communication array that connected directly to the Dravine homeworld. The door was already open when Rida arrived. Gulcher was standing behind his desk. He was enormous. Nearly 3 meters of dense reptilian muscle and natural bone plating that covered his body like ancient armor. His eyes were vertical slits of burning orange, and they tracked Rida as she stepped into the room with the calm focus of a predator evaluating prey. He had heard the screams of his enforcers on the lower decks. He had listened to the silence that followed. He had tried to contact each of them through his communicator and received nothing in return. He knew what was coming. He just did not believe it. A human, he said. His voice was deep and resonant, like stone grinding against stone. One small human female with a wrench. Rida did not answer. She stood just inside the doorway, breathing evenly, the wrench hanging loose in her right hand and the cutting wire coiled in her left. Her clothes were torn in several places. There was a bruise forming on her cheekbone where the sixth enforcer had clipped her with a wild swing before the clamp took him. Her ribs ached on the left side, where she had hit the wall during the fifth enforcer's chase. None of that mattered. Gulsher reached behind his desk and drew his plasma blade. The weapon hummed to life, a curved blade of superheated energy that could cut through station-grade steel like it was wet paper. It cast a pale blue glow across the office that made the shadows jump and shift. He told Rita she had made the last mistake of her short life. He told her he had personally killed 37 beings in single combat, and that a human female with repair tools was not worth the effort. Rita looked at him, then at the plasma blade, then at his right arm, covered in the thickest natural plating on his body, layered like the scales of an ancient earth crocodile. Almost impenetrable, she thought. Almost. Gulsher lunged. He was fast for his size. The plasma blade cut a burning arc through the air where Rita's head had been a half-second earlier. She ducked and rolled sideways, coming up behind his desk. He swung again, and the blade carved a glowing line across the desktop, splitting it in two. Rita threw the wrench at his face. Not to hurt him. The wrench bounced off his plating without leaving a mark. But it made him flinch, and that flinch gave her 1 second to move. She used that second to get inside his reach. Fighting a larger opponent at range was suicide. Every combat manual in human history agreed on this. If you were smaller, you got close. You made their size work against them. You turned their reach into a disadvantage. Rita pressed herself against Gulsher's torso, too close for him to swing the blade effectively. He snarled and grabbed at her with his free hand, catching her shoulder and squeezing with enough force to crack bone. Pain exploded down Rita's left arm. She gritted her teeth and ignored it. Pain was just information. Humans had learned that lesson a long time ago. She jammed the magnetic clamp against his right wrist, the wrist holding the plasma blade, and activated it at full power. The clamp locked onto the metal desk frame beneath them, and Gulsher's arm was yanked downward, pinned to the ruined desk with his hand still wrapped around the blade. He roared. The sound shook the walls. He pulled against the clamp with all the strength his massive body could produce, and the desk groaned and buckled, but the clamp held. Military-grade magnetic clamps were designed to secure 10-ton cargo containers during faster-than-light transit. A Dravine arm, no matter how strong, was not 10 tons. Gulsher twisted and tried to reach Rita with his free hand. She stepped back, just out of range, and uncoiled the cutting wire. His eyes changed. For the first time in the conversation, something behind those burning orange slits shifted. It was not anger. Anger he understood. Anger he could work with. This was fear, not fear of the wire. Not fear of the pain. Fear of the thing looking at him through this small human's eyes. There was no rage in her face. No hatred. No satisfaction. There was nothing at all, just a flat, empty focus that looked like a machine operating at peak efficiency. IT looked like a species that had spent 2 million years perfecting the art of taking things apart. Rita stepped forward. She pressed the cutting wire against the joint where Gulsher's natural armor was weakest, the soft gap between the upper arm plating and the forearm scales, where the muscles and tendons were exposed. She had studied Dravine anatomy in the station's medical database. She knew exactly where the plating ended and the flesh began. She pulled the wire. Gulsher's scream was the loudest sound Horizon Ring had heard in its operational history. When it was over, Rita stood in the silent office holding the severed arm of the most feared being on the station. It was heavy. The plasma blade was still humming in its dead grip. She deactivated the blade and let it clatter to the floor. Then she walked out, down the corridor, into the main elevator, and up to the station's central concourse where 400 aliens stood frozen, staring at her. She dropped the arm on the polished floor. It landed with a wet, heavy sound that echoed off the high ceiling. She looked at the crowd and said 5 words, "Stay away from my friend." Then she turned and walked toward the medical bay. The security footage played on every public screen on Horizon Ring for 6 hours before the station council figured out how to shut it off. Why then? It did not matter. Everyone had already seen it. Every merchant, every dock worker, every diplomat passing through on business, every child old enough to look at a screen. They had all watched the human girl walk through the Syndicate's territory in the dark and dismantle 7 armed enforcers like she was clearing inventory in a cargo bay. They had watched her fight Gulsher in his own office. They had watched her walk out carrying his arm. They had watched her drop it on the concourse floor and say 5 words that nobody on Horizon Ring would ever forget. The Dravine Syndicate collapsed within 48 hours. The IT did not collapse because Gulsher was dead. He was not dead. He was in the station's medical bay, sedated and stabilized, missing his right arm from the elbow joint down. The Dravine had regenerative biology. Given enough time and proper treatment, he would grow the arm back. But that was not the point. The point was that every being on the station had seen a human take it from him, and the fear that the Syndicate had built its empire on now belonged to someone else. Gulsher's enforcers recovered from their injuries over the following days. None of them returned to duty. 3 of them left the station on the first transport available. 2 more transferred to a mining outpost on the far side of the sector. The remaining 2 simply disappeared into the civilian population of Horizon Ring and pretended they had never heard the name Gulsher. The protection fees stopped. The new taxes stopped. The merchants on the lower decks opened their shops without paying anyone for the privilege. And for the first time in 2 years, the corridors of decks 15 through 18 were safe to walk through after dark. The Station Security Council held an emergency session. They reviewed the footage, the medical reports, the 7 dismissed complaints that had been filed against the Syndicate over the previous 2 years, and Ryda's own complaint that had been rejected within an hour. They voted unanimously to reform the complaint system. They also voted to increase security patrols on the lower decks. They did not vote to press charges against Ryda. Nobody on the council wanted to be the person who tried to arrest her. Solhai was released from the medical bay 4 days after the incident. Her broken arms had healed under regenerative treatment, though the medic warned her that the left one would always have a slight bend at the joint where the bone had been set improperly before Ryda brought her in. Solhai said she did not mind. She said it would remind her. When she saw Ryda for the first time since that night, she did not ask what happened. She already knew. Everyone on the station knew. She simply walked up to Ryda in the corridor outside the Botanical Archive and wrapped her 2 good arms around her and held on. Ryda stood very still for a moment. Then she put her arms around Solhai and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 days, the flat emptiness behind her expression broke apart and something warm and human came flooding back in. They stood like that for a long time. 3 weeks later, Ryda was summoned before a Galactic Tribunal. The hearing was held remotely. A panel of 5 judges from 5 different species, reviewing the incident from a secure judicial station halfway across the sector. The charges were excessive violence and destruction of property belonging to the Dravine Syndicate. Ryda attended the hearing alone. She wore her station uniform. She answered every question directly and without emotion. She described what had been done to Solhai. She described the dismissed complaint. She described what she had done in response and why. The tribunal reviewed the security footage. They reviewed Solhai's medical records. They reviewed the 7 previous complaints against the Syndicate, all dismissed. They reviewed Gulsher's criminal record, which included 14 counts of assault, 6 counts of extortion, and 2 counts of unlawful imprisonment across 3 different stations. The tribunal deliberated for 11 minutes. They ruled the matter as justified defense of a vulnerable species member, with a formal note in the official record that read, "Human behavioral response within expected Deathworld parameters. No further action recommended." The story spread that IT moved through trade stations and diplomatic channels and military briefings and university lectures across the galaxy. Not as a horror story, not as a war story. It spread as something quieter, a reminder. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the most advanced or the most numerous. They had arrived on the galactic stage barely a generation ago, and most species still thought of them as clever animals from a dangerous rock. But humans formed bonds, real bonds, deep bonds, the kind of bonds that did not break when things got hard or dangerous or hopeless. The kind of bonds that turned a quiet cargo handler into something that could walk through an army in the dark. Galactic scholars struggled to find a word for what humans became when someone they loved was threatened. The closest translation in any known language was simply relentless.it was not a perfect word, but it was close enough. 6 months after the incident, Rida was still working in Bay 14. She still sorted cargo labels. She still ate lunch in the botanical archive with Solhai, who had started growing a new species of flower, a deep violet bloom that she had engineered herself, which she said represented something important but refused to explain further. Every evening, Rida walked Solhai home. They talked about flowers. They talked about stars. They talked about small, quiet, ordinary things, and nobody bothered them again.